We're here with Toby from the Blockchain Founders Fund. How are you today, Toby?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
And how's
Really
it going?
appreciate it.
How's it going so far at World Blockchain Expo?
I think it's been quite interesting. I just had my panel where we talked about like overall the market in the space with all the recent bank challenges and so on and so forth. So it was a rough, past 2 weeks. But overall, I think it's still quite nicely visited. There's a lot of founders here and also some familiar faces. And obviously the venue is beautiful. So it's a good spot to be at.
So given those recent setbacks that the industry has had recently, what's your outlook right now? What are you specifically looking at as a fund? What's next?
So for us, we have been careful, but obviously still deploying. I mean, we just raised a new fund to invest in early stage companies. We raised $75 million a couple of weeks ago. And obviously we're going to deploy that carefully moving forward over the next 2.5, 3 years. And I think for now it's obviously favorable if you have cash because a lot of the valuations have normalized, right? And to be honest, surprisingly, we still see a lot of deal flow coming to our funnel. So for example, in February and March, we had one of our best months ever, where we had over 600 companies applying for funding in 1 month. So it's good that we see still builders in the space, right? Because towards the end of last year in November, it was a little bit of a dry season, not just from a capital perspective, but also from a founder perspective.
So what types of companies are coming to you? What sectors, what verticals?
To be honest, what's coming to us is very diverse, I would say. So first of all, from a geographic perspective, it's still predominantly US and obviously Asia because we're based in Singapore. So that's where I think 40 and 30% of the deal flow is coming from. We're building Europe and India right now and the Middle East as well, but the Middle East still doesn't have a lot of native projects, right? So there's a lot of people coming over to establish entities or to fundraise.
Right.
But companies from the region, we haven't seen as much yet, but I do believe it's coming up. I just came from Egypt. There's a lot of interest in blockchain, not so much the crypto side, but yeah, it's very agnostic. And then in terms of the segments, so we have basically 3 buckets of the fund. The first one is the blockchain layer in itself, where there's no crypto exposure, nothing else. It's very, Web2 investment, so to say. And then we have the infrastructure layer, where we look at a lot of like the mid-layer pieces, like the CK space, which was very predominant recently, right? Decentralized oracles, security for smart contracts, and many other of these ideas. And then we have like the crypto native bucket of the fund, which is mostly DeFi and a little bit of gaming. And then we're trying to figure out how to tackle metaverse, right? Because it's still obviously depending on hardware and many other players to establish something immersive.
Landscape in Singapore compared to Dubai. You said here there aren't that many native companies, so what about over there?
So I think Singapore has the benefit that there's a lot of talent trickling down from Hong Kong especially, but also in Singapore we have a lot of unicorns, both in the fintech and in also the consumer space. So the talent is now trickling down. So what we see, for example, is that the head of product from a ride-hailing company is now starting his own company because he figured out a specific area where he can tackle that with Web3 and crypto, right? As well as there's a lot of government-related institutions. I think the regulatory framework is a bit clearer, or at least like there's more support, I would say. And obviously there's capital in the market, right? Similar to Dubai. I think it's very similar to Dubai. I think it's just like a little bit more mature in terms of the actual innovation coming out of the space because the industry has been doing something longer, right? And of course, a lot of like China input, where like the tech wave was pretty big. Hong Kong came to China, and we have a lot of people. Right? Indonesia, 300 million people, because Singapore is tiny. Nothing is going to be unicorn in Singapore. It needs to have the outside markets.
Okay, I see. And so what about when it comes to maybe the institutional investors? What do you tell them? What do you counsel them when it comes to investing in a time like this?
I mean, obviously, I think the first piece is explaining that the technology hasn't failed, right? I mean, even if you look at the recent challenges, it's not that blockchain failed, right? Or Web3 failed. It's more like we're captured in a third party or like in a centralized entity, and then they took advantage, right? So I think that's one thing where we're trying to like just educate in a sense, but also we're being extremely transparent, right? So whenever there's something happening, we send a newsletter to our LPs and really explaining in detail, even from a balance sheet perspective, from all different stable coins, exactly of like what's going on, what's the liquidity, of why doing we that? Because in times like this, I think trust is the most important thing, right? And a lot of the companies who failed they went out and said nothing is wrong, and then 2 days later the thing collapsed, right? So a lot of people obviously worried that this is happening with projects or funds as well. So I think being ahead of the curve and extremely transparent is important, but also people understand actually, which is quite interesting, that now it's a good time to invest because a lot of stuff is way more reasonable priced, right? From a valuation perspective, but also just like general, like there's less capital in the market. So also as a fund, we have better chances of making reasonable terms, which then hopefully pays out moving forward.
That makes sense. And is there anything that you are particularly personally excited about? Maybe certain companies or projects, games?
I mean, I'm quite interested in the social space of crypto. I think it's still early, but I do think it will bring a lot of adoption into the space. I mean, similar to what gaming did, recently, where a lot of people came into the space. I think now it's interesting that we figure out, okay, how can we bring more people into the space? And that's not necessarily always through DeFi or finance, right? It's more like through everyday use cases where they figure out, okay, that's actually useful. It helps me figure out certain challenges. And so far we haven't seen the proper use case yet, but I think a lot of people building it and trying to understand it. And I'm looking very closely at that space.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Toby.
Awesome. Thank you.